here, Empress Goddess, the Georgia Peach, your host with the most. Let's get in here without further ado. I hope all is well with everyone. We're going to get in here with the conflict between thought and reality by my man, Manly P. Hall. Y'all make sure y'all hit that like button on the way in.
Assumed this morning, we want to take up a subject that really is more vital to us than we are inclined to realize. In the first place, our own thoughts are so near and so dear to our thinking that we seldom, if ever, attempt to analyze their basic validity. We accept them and assume them. And when someone suggests that we pause and think about our own thinking, it comes somewhat as a surprise. We are much more inclined to think about other people's thinking and to recommend changes that they should make in their mental habits. We have long assumed that the mind is an instrument intended to assist us in the determination of facts. Potentially, this is probably true, but actually, the mind of man is an imperfect instrument, incomplete, and still in the process of growth. It must follow, therefore, that the workings of this mind are not as yet perfect, nor are they complete, nor can we depend upon them in every way. Certainly the mind is more useful if we control and direct it. But to the average person, such control means an unreasonable degree of effort. So we permit thinking to jog along in its own natural way, and we follow after whatever conclusions may arise. Because the mind is the instrument with which we think, it is very difficult for us to get any orientation on it, for the very process of orientation is a process of thinking. If the mind, therefore, is not under a reasonable discipline, if it is not the object of constant attention, thought, and action, and we do not have some general rule or guide, control and direct thinking, we all develop bad habits. We develop bad mental outlooks. In the accumulation of that data which is used in thinking, we depend very heavily upon environment. For the most part, the thinking of the individual does not rise from his own internal activity, but from the pressure of circumstances around him. Thus, thinking becomes a method of interpreting phenomena. And as each life is surrounded by an intimate cycle of phenomena, and there are also broader and more general patterns which influence the mind. Because these pressures are almost constant, and because the internal orientation and direction is not constant, nor even consistent, the mind seemingly makes a partnership with phenomena and becomes more involved in the interpretation of phenomena than in the original function for which it was intended, namely the integration and education of the internal self. We assume, of course, that we are educated by the examination of phenomena. This might be true if the mind was absolutely dependable. But as we have mentioned before, research seems to indicate that mental processes are static unless they are made dynamic through emotional pressures. The individual living in a purely mental world in which there are no emotional factors would be living an extremely dull and probably incredible existence. We do think, but thought, like every other activity of man, is pressured by emotion, by feeling, by interest, and remains static under the negative qualification of indifference. So interest coming into our thinking causes us to become aware of some things and to remain unaware of other things. Interests with man are largely personal, and they are also very strongly influenced by basic desires, ambitions, prejudices, and these other emotional forces which interpret themselves through intellectual phenomena. If therefore a person was to look out upon this great world and examine everything in the pure term of fact, he would live a very unglamorous existence. An existence that would be so monotonous and so inevitable in its own elements that the person would have no inspiration, encouragement, or vitality. He would face all things to the discovery that fact itself is not fruitful. While we cherish the thought of fact, while we constantly talk about the importance of fact, nearly all fact is sterile unless it is vitalized by interpretation. Statistics is a good example of this. The mere fact that a certain number of persons are injured or killed in traffic accidents in the United States, this fact is of very little basic interest to the individual and very seldom results in a major correction of difficulty. If, however, for some reason this fact strikes upon us emotionally and we become excited, worried, or agitated by it, then this fact becomes dynamic. I begin to think about it, perhaps not in a useful manner, but certainly in an intense. The facts, therefore, are in themselves useful only because they stimulate an interpretive or evaluating power within the thinking of the person. In the same way, the facts living around us as human beings are eternal. Fact never changes. The rising and setting of the sun, the flowing of water downhill, the law of gravity, these phenomenal realities around us, we come to accept. We pay little, if any, attention to them, and are perturbed only if we see what appears to be an irregularity or an exception to a well-accustomed rule. Then our first thought is to talk the exception out of existence, because it annoys and worries us. Thus, facts by themselves and in their own natural estates leave us cold. But man is not inclined to such a chilly mentation. He inevitably dramatizes. And in the process of dramatization, he calls upon his own inner resources to lighten and to color and to give tonality to his facts. And here the mind comes in, because it is the instrument by means of which we transform so-called facts into some kind of knowledge, of some kind of wisdom, and especially, if possible, a depth of understanding. Thus the facts themselves lead us to the enlargement upon these facts. And as we enter various fields of activity, we can see how diverse the interpretations of facts may be. We all live, for example, in one world, basically. Yet in this world, we have created a great many separate interpretive institutions. We live under the same sun. We see the motion of the planets. We know the rotation of the earth. We observe the passing of the seasons and the growth, development, maturity of living things. Yet although this procedure is equally observed by everyone, it is not equally understood, nor is it similarly interpreted. As a result, from this phenomenal life that we live, there have been nearly 500 different religious philosophies created to explain the obvious. No one has questioned the facts. Everyone has questioned what they mean. Also, it has been generally questioned as to the source and cause of these facts, how they should be applied to the individual, and what man's moral, ethical, and spiritual duties are toward facts. On these points, there is wide difference. And this difference may be so intense and so consistent as to result in broad programs of persecution and to drench the world with the blood of those who are dying for their interpretations of facts. Yet very seldom do the facts demand such sacrifice. The sacrifice is due to man's interpretation. Now, in private life, numerous persons are dying for their interpretations of life. They are living in a world with millions of their kind, their neighbors, their friends, their families. Each of these groups lives according to its own interpretations. And yet, even while we observe the contrary effects of interpretations in the lives of others, we remain closely associated and devout in our maintenance of our own ideas. How should we live in order that we may release or relax some of this tension about these factual things, which seldom, if ever, really mean much to us? It is only their interpretation, our own explanation, that becomes highly meaningful. This fall, we are going to go into another election year. Already the rumblings of it are in the air. A prominent leader rises and makes a speech. His friends tell us that this speech is going to save the nation. His enemies tell us that this speech indicates that it will destroy the nation. Now, which one is right? There is no agreement, and yet the words themselves are available to everyone. Yet in interpreting these words, what are going to be our instruments? Are we going to take these words and analyze them semantically? Are we going to very carefully consider each syllable, the total arrangement, the punctuation, real or implied? And also, are we going to apply these words directly and inevitably to the national good? A few will, but the majority will not. For the majority, the meaning of the speech will be determined by political allegiance. If we are for the man, he is making a world-saving speech. If we are against him, he is making a world-destroying speech. And we will take his words and prove it. Not so many centuries ago, Cardinal Richelieu said on one occasion, "Give me one paragraph of any man's writings, and I will hang him for treason. All I have to do is interpret it. All we have to do is to very carefully make each word in this written speech sustain some prejudice of our own, and we will have the individual at our mercy. Now, one way, for example, that this can be done rather efficiently these days is in tape recordings. These are not generally allowed in courts in many areas of the world because they are so easily doctored. You can take a tape recording, cut out certain words and reverse the meaning, put the tape together. There will not be a word in it the man did not speak. But you can use this tape to work a serious and terrible hardship upon him simply by careful editing. Now, that would be something that most of us would never stoop to do. But it is happening inside of ourselves all the time because we edit everything we hear. We carefully leave out any words or thoughts that would imply any imperfection of ourselves to start with. We just don't hear them. The next thing we carefully eliminate is anything that disagrees with us. We just do not hear it. Or if we hear the words, we throw them away intuitively and instinctively, covering the whole procedure by the broad assumption that any disagreement with us is error, therefore not necessary to be further considered. We then take whatever is left after we get through with this process of mental mutilation, hitch it together again, and perhaps pass it on as the absolute, literal statement of our friend. As a result of that, we cost him all his friends, which perhaps is one of the original intentions. Such editing is commonly known as gossip and is a very frequent occurrence. Yet the average gossip, if placed upon a lie detector or polygraph, would be able to prove reasonably conclusively that he believed what he was saying. This editing process has automatically eliminated all mental competition. He just does not know that he has done it. Or if he does know, he promptly forgets that as something best not to be remembered. So we find that this mental equipment of ours is very ingenious and that it is exceedingly pliable. It can do the things we want done and then settle down to the simple proof that they are right. That such was a more or less primitive, even aboriginal approach to subject matter is indicated by the rise of that great system of philosophy which we had in the Middle Ages known as scholasticism. Now, scholasticism was a combination of religion and philosophy within an inflexible framework of dogma. The important and inevitable requirement was that the dogma should be preserved. Nothing must happen to that. And as dogma is exceedingly dogmatic, there is no question but that this frame became a prison around the human mind. Yet everyone believed he was right, everyone knew he was good, and most together really believed that they were thinking for the glory of God. They were perfectly sincere. But when we see what this iron frame of mental limitation imposed upon men of the caliber of Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas Aquinas, we realize that it stifled them, that they would have been truly magnificent thinkers had they been able to escape from this iron-bound limitation. Yet this limitation, existing in their own minds as accepted by them, and existing in society as a common force for which they knew no antidote at that time, this locked them and caused scholasticism to be a great system in which people reasoned from conclusions and not toward them. You decided first what the answer was. Then you kept working with the elements until you could make them fit the answer. Now, scholasticism did not die with the birth of humanism. Scholasticism did not perish in the flames of the Inquisition or in the horrors of the Revolution. Scholasticism passed out of public appeal, but retained a high measure of private favor, and has ever since. Nearly all untrained thinkers are instinctively scholastics today, because they are working constantly to prove that they are right, and not to prove that facts are right. The individual dedicated to a long and critical career of self-justification can perform some mental acrobatics that are simply extraordinary. He can very definitely eliminate all truth and never miss it. He can create a fantastic superstructure of logical inaccuracies. He can think straight from a crooked premise, or he can think in a most crooked and miserable way from a straight line of original induction or deduction. He can make the most absurd logical statements, which are completely consistent from a false position in the first place. This, of course, is all the easier because our entire superstructure of knowledge is built upon a very uncertain foundation. One of the things that we should never do is look in the basement of our concept of learning. It rises with magnificent spires and spans and arches. It stands like the great Cathedral of St. Mark's in Venice, a wonder of the world. But it is resting on some very ancient and rather insecure pilings driven down into a very insecure mudflat underneath what is now most of the city of Venice. In the same way, our philosophies of life are not built upon absolute knowledge, absolute truth, absolute fact. They are built for the most part upon basic acceptances. When you start to think about anything, somewhere in the early stages of that thinking, you must either accept or reject something. If you do not accept or reject something which you cannot prove, the future of your thinking is not going to be very extensive. Your thinking, once it has made a basic acceptance or rejection, can build upon that a magnificent and orderly superstructure. You can build as high